Nestled deep in the Carpathian Mountains, the village of Krasna was a place forgotten by time. With only a handful of residents, it was isolated from the modern world, shrouded in thick forests and surrounded by towering peaks. The villagers lived simple lives, but there was one rule they all followed without question: never speak of the night the silence came. Emily, a historian with a passion for uncovering the unknown, had heard rumors of Krasna and its strange, secretive inhabitants. Intrigued by the village's isolation and mysterious history, she decided to visit and learn more. When she arrived, she was struck by the eerie quiet that seemed to envelop the entire village. The air was thick with an oppressive stillness, and the villagers, though polite, seemed distant. Their eyes filled with a silent fear. Emily checked into the village's only inn, a small, creaky building that looked as if it had been standing for centuries. The innkeeper, an elderly woman with a face etched by years of hardship, warned Emily to stay indoors after sunset and not to wander off into the woods. But when pressed for details, she would only shake her head and mutter about the dangers of curiosity. Despite the villagers' reticence, Emily's curiosity only grew. She spent her days exploring the village, trying to piece together its history. The old stone church at the center of Krasna seemed to be the oldest structure, its walls covered in strange symbols and carvings that Emily couldn't quite decipher. She noticed that the villagers always hurried past the church, avoiding looking at it for too long. At night, Emily would hear strange sounds, whispers carried on the wind, soft rustling outside her window, and sometimes the faintest echoes of footsteps. When she asked the villagers about it, they grew even more reserved, some even refusing to speak to her. One evening, Emily ventured out into the village after dark, despite the warnings. She wanted to see what the villagers were so afraid of. The night was pitch black, with only the dim light of her lantern guiding her. As she passed the church, she noticed something odd, a faint, flickering light inside. Curiosity piqued, she approached the church and found the door slightly ajar. Pushing it open, she stepped inside, only to be met with a chilling sight. The pews were filled with shadowy figures, their faces obscured by darkness. They sat in eerie silence, staring at the altar where a single candle burned. As Emily's eyes adjusted to the dim light, she realized with horror that the figures were not alive. They were corpses preserved in their seated positions, as if frozen in time. Before she could react, a cold hand gripped her shoulder. Spinning around, Emily found herself face to face with the innkeeper who had followed her. The old woman's eyes were wide with fear, and she whispered, "You must leave now, before it's too late." Back at the inn, the innkeeper finally revealed the village's dark secret. Many years ago, Krasna had been a lively, prosperous village, but that all changed one fateful night. A group of strangers arrived, seeking shelter from a storm. They were welcomed by the villagers and offered food and lodging. But the next morning, the village was silent. The strangers had vanished, and with them, the voices of the villagers. No one could speak. Their voices were stolen by a malevolent force that had come with the strangers. Those who tried to leave the village would be found dead, their mouths frozen in a silent scream. The villagers soon learned that the only way to survive was to remain silent and never speak of that night. They believed that the spirits of the strangers were still there, haunting the village and punishing those who broke the silence. Emily was horrified by the story, but her rational mind struggled to accept it. She decided to leave the village the next day, but as night fell, the whispers grew louder, and the shadows seemed to come alive. She could feel eyes watching her from every corner, and the oppressive silence became unbearable. Determined to leave before she became another victim of the village's curse, Emily packed her belongings and prepared to leave at first light. But as she tried to leave her room, she found the door wouldn't budge. Panicked, she realized that the innkeeper was nowhere to be found, and the village seemed deserted. She rushed to the church, hoping to find someone who could help, but the sight that greeted her froze her in her tracks. The church was empty, except for one figure standing at the altar, a woman in a long, tattered dress, her back turned to Emily. As Emily approached, the woman slowly turned around, revealing a face twisted in agony, her mouth sewn shut with crude, black threads. The figure raised a hand, pointing to the door, and in a voice that seemed to echo from the depths of the earth, she whispered, "Leave now, or share our fate." Terrified, Emily fled the church and ran through the village, her heart pounding. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if the very walls of the village were closing in on her. She finally reached the edge of the forest, where the path leading out of Krasna began. As she looked back, she saw the villagers standing at the edge of the trees, watching her with empty, soulless eyes. The silence was deafening, but in her mind, she could still hear the whispers, urging her to leave and never return. Without looking back again, Emily sprinted down the path, the village fading into the mist behind her. The whispers followed her for miles, growing fainter with each step until, finally, they disappeared, leaving her in blessed silence. Emily never spoke of Krasna again, but the memory haunted her. She published a short article about a forgotten village in the mountains, omitting the darker details, but the experience had changed her. She moved to a bustling city, far from the silence and shadows that had nearly consumed her. But sometimes, in the quiet of the night, she could still hear the faint whispers of the villagers, calling to her from the darkness. And deep down, she knew that Krasna was still there, hidden in the mountains, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to stumble upon its cursed silence.